Welcome to Hartman Math. This is lesson 612 where we are graphing the cosine function. We're going to take a look and remind ourselves of the angles and the coordinates represented in the first quadrant and some of the quadrant angles here that we could use to extend to other quadrants. Our key angles, which represent some of the angles in our special right triangles, would be 30 degrees, 45 degrees, 60 degrees. Our coordinates, straight right, 1 unit, unit circle, 1, 0. 30 degrees would be long and short in the 30, 60, 90. So long is the square root of 3/2. Short is the 1/2. 45, 45, 90. If we look at that as a right triangle, it's an isosceles right triangle, which means the legs are the same. That's where we have root 2/2, comma, root 2/2. 60 degrees, kind of the reverse here. We're short going this way, long going up, 1/2, comma, the square root of 3/2. And straight up would be 0, 1. Looked at this previously for the graphing the sine function. Today is just the cosine function, so we are focusing on the x coordinates. As we graph this, again, we're going to need some graph paper. We're going to need 24 spaces going to the right because each box is going to represent 15 degrees on the x-axis, and we are going to label those. The y-axis, we can kind of do it how we want, but we're going to do this where each of these is worth 1/4 or 0.25 units. And that's going to put 4 units up would be +1, 4 units down is -1, and then let's label 15 degrees. You don't have to mark that, but let's mark every 2, we're going to put it at 30 degrees, 30 degrees, 60 degrees, 90, 120, 150, 180, and so on. Make sure these are all degrees. So we begin kind of table of values. We'll just kind of talk our way through it. We would start at 0, 0 degrees, cosine of 0 degrees. The x-coordinate at 0 degrees, straight right, was 1, 0. The x-coordinate was 1, so cosine is 1 at 0 degrees. It's 1. So it starts right there. And then 30 degrees, the x-coordinate was the square root of 3/2. If we use a calculator, it's going to say that's about 0.87. So 0.75, about halfway between these two at 30 degrees. Is our square root of 3/2. 45 degrees is next. Don't forget that one. Don't skip that one. It's between the 30 and the 60, 15 degrees apart. And the square root of 2/2, comma, square root of 2/2 are the coordinates for 45 degrees. So it's a square root of 2/2. That's about 0.7, just a little bit below the third line there. Cosine of 60 degrees, that was short going left to the right. That's 1/2. So it is 1/2, which is 0.5, and that is 2 spaces up, halfway to 1. And now we skip over to 90 degrees. We do not have a key angle at 75 degrees. We do at 90 degrees, and the cosine of 90 degrees straight up, the x-coordinate is 0. So we kind of see what's going on, and that shape is going to continue as we move into quadrant 2, where we are moving now left and up. Cosine is the x-coordinate, so going left, we're going to get some negative values. So 120 degrees is going to be -1/2. And then this trend continues. Negative square root 2/2, it's about -0.7. Negative square root 3/2. And at 180, it's -1. Now we move into quadrant number 3. Still negative. We're going to see we're going to have some symmetry here. Mirror image, there to there. Mirror image, here to here. Some symmetry. And at 270 degrees, we're back to 0. Quadrant 4, where we are right and down, since we're going right and we're talking about the x-coordinate, these are going to be positive. We're going to be up here as we continue our wave pattern. 300. Cosine of 300 degrees is 1/2. Then we get this one here, square root of 2 over 2, square root of 3 over 2. We're going to finish up 360 degrees right where we started at 1. This is the cosine curve. It's a wave. It looks very similar to the sine curve in terms of being a wave, it just starts in a different place. Sine had started on the midline, or the x-axis, as a base graph. Cosine starts up above the midline at its maximum, and then finishes there if we say that this is one full period where we complete one full cycle. After that, it repeats itself. So let's look at some of the key features of the graph: the domain, the range, increasing, decreasing, positive, negative. Domain, again, a reminder, it's going to keep going. It's going to keep going. It's going to bend this way. It's going to come back down. This is the highest point, so it doesn't keep going up. It's going to go like this, but it does keep going to the left. It does keep going to the right. We can plug in any x value and take the cosine of any angle. So it's all real numbers. It's from negative infinity to positive infinity. The range is exactly the same as it was for the sine function. The lowest we go is -1. The highest we go is +1. So our range is between -1 and +1. Inclusive, that's why we have the brackets. Where is our graph going up? Not here, going down, 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 down. Oh, here, we're going to start to go up. We started going up at 180, up, 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 still up, until we get to 360 degrees. Down, or is it decreasing? It was going down this part of the graph. So, 0 degrees to 180 degrees. Where is it positive? Where are we above? We're above here. We're above over here. From 0 to 90, from 270 to 360. Two different intervals on that one. Where are we negative? Where are we below the x-axis? In quadrants 2 and 3, that's where cosine was negative. So from 90 degrees to 270 degrees. Example number 1, f of x is cosine graph. Let's do it without all those points. Let's focus on the key points, those red points, which happen at our quadrant angles. So let's label these. Straight up, 90 degrees, straight left, 180, straight down, 270, and back to the right at 360 degrees. We started 0, the cosine of 0 was 1. Once again, we're starting at the maximum. We're starting above the midline. Since it's a base graph, the x-axis is the midline. So we're going to start there. No matter what, once you're here on a cosine or a sine graph, if you are above the midline, the next one has to be, as a key point, on the midline. So we're on the midline. And if we were above here and then on, we must be going below. That is the trend. So we're below the midline. Cosine of 180 degrees is -1. Back to the midline. Back above. Those are the key points. Now the challenge is to appropriately draw the wave that passes through. It's a little bit trickier here because it's harder to visualize with these key points rather than the sine, which has that natural wave-like motion here for one period. So the tendency is to do something like, oh, I'm just going to connect. And that's not a wave. It's way too straight. There are no parts that are straight. So we need to be very curved at all times. So the best way to do that is to do these little parabolas. So the bottom part here in the middle, think of that as a parabola that is bending like that. And then the same thing over here. Remember, this is going to continue, so think of this as a wave like this and over here. And then you can just erase the parts that actually we don't need, and then we have that nice wave shape. Let's see how we did. There it is. The period is the distance to complete one full cycle that started here and ended here for the cosine function. From 0 degrees to 360 degrees is a distance of 360 degrees. The midline, the x-axis cuts it in half, half above, half below. The midline is the horizontal line, y equals 0. Amplitude is the distance from the midline to the highest point, and that is 1. Example number 2, graph g of x equals 2 cosine of x. If we wanted to do this by plugging in points, we could do that. We do know the period is going to be 360 degrees as we set our scale. Almost forgot about that. Period 360 degrees. Cosine of 0 degrees is 1. We saw that on the last one. We multiply that value of 1 by 2 and we get 2. So we're going to start above the midline. Cosine starts above the midline. We're going to go 2 above the midline. That's right here. If the first key point is above the midline, the next one must be on the midline. And then the next one above, on, the next one has to be below. How far below? It's going to be 2 below the midline. We return to the midline. You can't skip over. You can't go from below to above. You have to visit the midline again, and then we're back above. We start where we finish where we started, and again, work on drawing the curve here, curve here, curve here. Every part of it is curved, no straight parts. Midline is y equals 0. Amplitude, distance from midline to the highest point, is 2 units. Amplitude is 2. All right, it's now your turn. Go ahead and pause the video here as you work through graphing, labeling the x-axis on your graph to appropriately scale it. Graph, determine the period, the midline, the amplitude. Hit play when you're ready. We got, here's our scale. Our period is 360 degrees. Cosine is typically going to start above the midline, but it is negative, so that's going to flip it. We're going to start below the midline, 3 below the midline. We're going to start right there. So if we start below, the next one must be on. The next one must be above. How far above? 3 above. Back to the midline. Below the midline. A little bit harder as we stretch this out. Try not to be straight. Curve here, curve there, curve there. Notice the curve. The midline was y equals 0. The amplitude, distance from midline to highest point or lowest point, 3, 3. It's 3. Example number 3, graph c of x is equal to 2 times the cosine of x minus 1. Let's set our scale. 90 degrees, 180 degrees. These are our quadrant angles. We know what the period is going to be, 360 degrees. The midline. Let's look at the midline. Midline is essentially the vertical shift in the graph. That's right here. This says we're going to shift down 1. So it would typically be the x-axis, but we're going to shift that down 1. that becomes y equals -1. Let's draw it horizontally. There's our midline. We're doing the cosine graph. Cosine graph typically starts above the midline. It's going to be 2 above. This is a positive 2, so there is no reflection. It is going to be above, 2 above. Here's our midline starting at 0, midline. Let's start above. Let's start 2 above. 1, 2. Here's our first key point. And then whether it's a sine graph or a cosine graph, the pattern is the same. Once we get that first point established, here, if we're above, the next one's got to be on. And the next one's got to be below. How far below? 2 below the midline. Back to the midline. Now we're above. Curve, curve, curve. Get the shape. The amplitude, the distance from the midline to the highest point is 2 units. Amplitude is 2. It is now your turn to graph r of x, which is equal to negative cosine x plus 2. Pause the video here until you have everything. All right, let's make sure we've labeled our scale. Remember that our period is just cosine x, and that's what we've been working on. It's going to be 360 degrees. The midline, the vertical translation, up 2. Y equals 2. Draw it. Horizontal line, up 2. There's our midline. All right, for key points, we're going to start. Cosine typically starts above the midline, but we've got a negative. So we've got a reflection. It's not going to start above. It's going to start below. How far below? Well, there is an invisible 1 right there for our stretch, so it's really not stretching. It's just reflecting where it would normally be 1 above. Now it's 1 below. We're going to start right there. We're going to start right there. Like that. So we're going to start below. The next one's got to be on. The next one's got to be above. Back to the midline. And now we're below. So this time, this is the curve here. Curve this way, as we get to graph the cosine function. Amplitude, distance from midline to highest point, is 1 unit. All right, our last one's example number 4, where we've got an existing function and we're going to try to decode and get the function f of x. We really just need to come up with the A, so stretch and or reflect, and the D, the vertical shift. Let's start with D by investigating the midline. What line cuts this graph in half? Let's draw it. Right through here is where it cuts it in half, where we've got half of our graph below, half of our graph above. So that tells us that D is -2. Now, what about A? Well, A is the vertical stretch, and the distance from the midline to the highest point is 2. We just got to figure out if A is 2 or if it's -2. So did we start above the midline, or did we reflect with a negative to start below the midline? We started above the midline. So A must be positive. A is +2. D is -2. So our function f of x is 2 cosine x minus 2. And that's it for today. I'll see you next time.